He raised his glass and smiled at me like I was nothing, like I had always been nothing. And I thought, after 31 years, after everything I had carried alone, after every mortgage payment and school trip and Christmas morning I had made happen by myself, I thought I had finally learned not to let men like him make me feel small. I was wrong. For about 30 seconds I was wrong. Then I stood up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, because the ending only makes sense when you understand the beginning. And the beginning wasn't the wedding. The beginning was a Thursday morning in October in a hospital parking lot in Hamilton, Ontario, when I was 34 years old and my husband told me he wasn't coming home. My daughter was 4. She was in the back seat eating a cheese string, completely unaware that her father had just looked me in the eye and said the words that would define the next 3 decades of my life. I don't want this anymore. That was it. No explanation that made sense. No real conversation. He had a new woman. I found that out later. And he left with the efficiency of someone cancelling a magazine subscription. Within 8 months, the divorce was final. Within a year, he had a new baby with her. My daughter grew up knowing she had a half-sibling somewhere across the city who shared her father's nose, and she carried that quietly the way children carry things they haven't been given language for yet. I went back to work full-time at the insurance firm where I'd been working part-time since she was born. I got a second job on weekends for 2 years, doing data entry from home after she went to bed. I sold the house in Westdale because I couldn't carry the mortgage alone, and we moved into a rental on the east side of the city. Smaller, noisier, closer to the school, which was what mattered. My daughter never complained once about the move. She was 6. She helped carry boxes and asked if her room could have yellow walls. I painted them yellow. Those years were not romantic. I won't dress them up for you. There were winters when I counted what was in my bank account before buying groceries, when I turned the heat down to 18 and told her it was an adventure to wear sweaters inside. There were parent-teacher interviews where I sat alone in a small plastic chair while other couples filed in together. And I smiled at her teacher and said everything was fine at home, and it was just not the way he meant it when he asked. There were Friday nights when she was at a sleepover, and I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and allowed myself, just for an hour, to feel the full weight of it. Then I washed the glass, went to bed, and got up Saturday morning and kept going. She was my reason for everything. Not in the way people say that to sound selfless. I mean it practically, mechanically. She was the engine. When I didn't want to negotiate a raise I was owed, I thought of her university tuition and walked into that office. When I wanted to quit the second job, I thought of the dental appointment she needed and didn't quit. When the loneliness got heavy, I thought of her yellow room and her cheese strings and her laugh that sounded like bells, and I kept going. She grew up kind. That was the thing that surprised me most, honesty. Not that she was smart, not that she worked hard, but that she was genuinely, instinctively kind. In a way I hadn't managed to teach her because I'd been too busy surviving to teach it. She just came out that way. Teachers called me to say so. Friends' parents called me to say so. By the time she was in her 20s, I was looking at this person and thinking, I did not make this. She made herself. I just kept the lights on. She started dating him when she was 27. I didn't meet him for the first 3 months, which wasn't unusual for her. She was private about relationships, always had been. When she finally brought him to Sunday dinner at my apartment in Burlington, he showed up with a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir and a genuine question about my work, and he looked at her the way I had always hoped someone would look at her. I liked him immediately. I trusted that instinct. His name was Owen. He was 30, an environmental consultant, originally from a small town near Sudbury. He'd gone to school in Ottawa, worked in Vancouver for a few years, come back east. His mother had passed away when he was in university. His father, he mentioned once in passing, had been difficult. I didn't ask more. It wasn't my place yet. They dated for 2 years. He proposed at her favorite spot on the Bruce Trail. Not a surprise to me. She had called me from the trail 3 times that year saying she thought it might happen soon. When she called to tell me he proposed, she was crying and laughing at the same time, and I sat on my couch and let myself cry too. The good kind, the kind you've been saving for a long time. The wedding planning began, and that's when I met his father. His name was Gerald. He drove a very large truck and wore the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes, the practiced smile of someone who had learned long ago that appearing warm was useful. He owned a construction company based out of Sudbury, had expanded over the years into contracting work across northern Ontario, and had what I later understood was a reputation in certain circles for cutting corners in ways that were hard to prove and easy to deny. The first time I met him was at a dinner we all had together at a restaurant in Mississauga to discuss wedding logistics. He shook my hand and said it was wonderful to meet the woman who had raised such a remarkable young woman. He said it the way people say things when they've already decided they're not interested in the answer. Over the next several months of planning, I noticed small things. The way he spoke over Owen in conversation, the way he referenced money, his money, what he was contributing to the wedding, in ways that seemed designed to establish a hierarchy. He was paying for the venue, which was generous, and he made sure no one forgot it. When I suggested the caterer my daughter had chosen, he said pleasantly that he had a contact in the industry who could do it better for less. My daughter deferred to him. Owen went quiet in those moments. I kept my concerns to myself. He was the father of the groom. The wedding was 6 months away. I told myself that difficult fathers-in-law were survivable. Then, at the engagement party held at Gerald's property north of Sudbury, a large house on a lake that he had clearly built to impress, something happened that I haven't spoken about publicly until now. I was inside getting a glass of water when I overheard him in the hallway talking on the phone. He didn't know I was there. I heard numbers, large ones, and phrases that didn't fit a legitimate conversation. He said the name of the project I had processed an insurance claim for 2 years earlier at my firm, a claim involving a subcontractor who had been injured on a worksite, a claim that had been disputed because the site's safety records had irregularities that no one at my level had been able to fully explain, and that had eventually been settled, quietly, for significantly less than the injured worker deserved. I had always wondered why. Standing in that hallway, with a glass of water, I began to understand. I didn't say anything. I walked back outside. I stood beside my daughter and watched her laugh at something Owen said, and I thought, what do I do with this? She was radiant. She had waited her whole life for a love like this. Owen was not his father. She was not responsible for what I had just heard. I said nothing. That was my mistake. I told myself it was protection. I told myself I needed more information, that I hadn't heard enough to be certain, that blowing up her engagement on the basis of a partial phone conversation would be something I could never take back. All of that was true, but the deeper truth, the one I've had to sit with since, was that I was afraid of being the mother who ruined everything, afraid of her looking at me the way I had looked at her father when he left, like I was the one causing the pain. So I kept it to myself, and I started quietly doing research. It took me 4 months. I still had contacts at my firm, and one contact in particular, a woman I'd worked with for 15 years who had moved into corporate liability investigation, who could access records I couldn't. I didn't tell her everything. I told her enough. What she found confirmed what I suspected, and then went further than I had imagined. Gerald's construction company had a history of falsified safety documentation on at least 3 major projects in northern Ontario over the past decade. There had been 2 serious worker injuries that had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. There was a pattern of bidding on provincial contracts and then subcontracting the safety-critical work to unregistered operations. None of it had resulted in charges. All of it had been buried with money and legal pressure and the particular silence that falls over small communities when the man with the biggest truck is also the man who employs their neighbors. I compiled everything. I printed it. I put it in a folder, and I kept it in the drawer of my bedside table under my reading material. And I told myself I would decide what to do with it after the wedding. I should have told my daughter. I know that now. I knew it then, in some part of me, that I ignored because the wedding was 8 weeks away, and she was the happiest I had ever seen her, and I was a coward in the specific way that love makes you a coward. Not in protecting yourself, but in protecting the people you can't bear to watch suffer. The wedding was in July, at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. 280 guests, a white tent strung with warm lights, the kind of evening that Ontario occasionally produces in summer that makes you forgive it for every February you've ever lived through. My daughter was extraordinary. I stood in the back of a small room with her before the ceremony, adjusting the clasp on her necklace, a thin gold chain that had been my mother's, and she looked at me in the mirror and said, "I couldn't have gotten here without you, Mum." And I held it together, barely, and said, "You got here yourself. I just watched." The ceremony was perfect. The dinner was beautiful. And then Gerald stood up to give his speech. He spoke for a long time. He told stories about Owen's childhood, funny ones, well delivered, and the room laughed easily. He thanked the venue, complimented the food, thanked the guests for traveling. He acknowledged Owen's late mother with what appeared to be genuine emotion. People around me were nodding, smiling. He was good at this. And then he turned to me. He said, with that smile, with a room full of people listening, that he wanted to acknowledge the brave little effort I had made, raising my daughter on my own. He said it warmly, the way you'd praise a child who had finished their vegetables. He said that he imagined it hadn't been easy, doing it without much support, and that he was glad his son had brought someone into the family who had, at least, turned out well, despite the circumstances. Despite the circumstances. The table went quiet. The people nearest to me looked at me, then looked away. My daughter's face, I saw her face, when still in a way I recognized from when she was small, and trying not to cry in public. I felt something happen in my chest, not anger, exactly, something older and colder and very, very patient. I stood up. I don't know what the room expected. I think they expected me to smile and raise my glass and absorb it, the way women my age have spent decades being trained to absorb things. That is what he expected. I could see it in the microsecond of confusion that crossed his face before he registered that I was still standing and not sitting down. I said calmly that I wanted to thank Gerald for his kind words, and that since he had brought up the subject of circumstances, I thought it was a good moment to discuss them. I reached into my bag. I had brought 3 pages, printed double-sided, a summary of what my contact had found. Worksite safety violations, falsified documentation, the 2 workers whose settlements had included silence, and the name of a journalist at the Toronto Star who had been investigating Northern Ontario construction contracts and to whom I had, 2 weeks prior, sent the full file. I had sent it 2 weeks before the wedding. I want to be clear about that. I hadn't done it impulsively. I had thought about it for months, and then I had made a deliberate choice that if I couldn't tell my daughter and risk her happiness before the wedding, I could at least ensure that the information was already in motion, already in the hands of someone who would do something with it, before I walked into that tent, so that whatever happened at that dinner, it wasn't the end of it, it was the beginning of the end of it. I didn't read from the pages. I didn't need to. I held them up, and I spoke clearly. I've always had a clear voice. 30 years in insurance teaches you to be precise. And I said that I understood Gerald had spent a long time making sure certain stories didn't get told, that I understood he was very good at it, that he had legal resources and community influence and a habit of making injured people very quiet. I said that I hoped he understood that the journalist already had what I had, and that the Ontario Labour Relations Board had received a formal complaint that morning through a worker advocacy organisation in Sudbury, and that a copy of the file was currently sitting in a sealed envelope with my solicitor in Burlington, with instructions that made its delivery automatic regardless of what happened to me. The room was completely silent. His face, that smile, went through several phases in about 4 seconds. I watched it happen, the confusion, the calculation, the beginning of the response he was preparing, and then the moment he realized he couldn't perform his way out of this one, not here, not in front of 280 people, half of whom knew someone who had worked at Gerald's side, half of whom had heard rumors that had never gone anywhere before. He sat down. My daughter was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Owen had gone very still. I turned to both of them, and I said, in a quieter voice, not for the room, for them, that I was sorry I hadn't said this sooner, that I had made a choice that wasn't mine to make, that Owen deserved to know who his father was, and my daughter deserved to have made this decision with full information, and I had let my fear of hurting her override her right to the truth, that I was sorry for that, and I would be sorry for that for the rest of my life. Then I sat down, picked up my wine glass, and took a sip. The band started playing. Bless them, they read the room and went immediately into something upbeat, and the evening resumed the way evenings resume after unexpected things happen at tables, slowly, carefully, with people talking to the people next to them in lowered voices. Gerald left before dessert. His wife, Owen's stepmother, stayed. She came to find me during the dancing, and she squeezed my hand and said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. The fallout was not simple, and I won't pretend it was. My daughter didn't speak to me for 6 weeks, not because she thought I was wrong. I don't think she ever thought I was wrong, but because of the part where I had known for months and said nothing. That was the wound. I understood it completely. I had made a choice to manage her emotions instead of trusting her with the truth, and she felt that. You feel it when someone decides what you can handle. You feel it regardless of how much they love you. Owen was the one who called me first. It was a Sunday morning, and I was sitting on my balcony with coffee, and he called and said, "I need you to know that I am not my father." I said, "I know that. I have always known that." He said, "My mother knew too. She tried to leave him twice and couldn't." We talked for a long time that morning. It was the beginning of something real between us. Not the polite relationship of in-laws, but something that understood itself properly. When my daughter called, she called at night. She cried first, and so did I. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "Because I was afraid of being the reason you were unhappy." And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mum, you are never the reason I'm unhappy," which was generous of her and probably not entirely accurate, but it was what I needed to hear. Gerald's company is currently under investigation by the Ministry of Labour. The journalist's piece ran in the fall and was shared widely. 3 of the workers whose settlements had included NDAs have since come forward. One of them said publicly that he had been waiting for years for someone to make the first move. 2 other former subcontractors have filed complaints. It is a slow process, the kind that takes years and may or may not result in the consequences it should. I am not naive about that. The legal system moves the way it moves, and money cushions things it shouldn't. But it is moving. Last spring, my daughter and Owen had their first child, a girl. She has her mother's laugh, that bell sound, the one I've been hearing for 30 years. And she has Owen's dark eyes and absolutely nobody's patience when she's hungry, which I find personally relatable. I was there the day she was born. I stood in a hospital in Hamilton, the same city, a different hospital, a different parking lot than the one where my life changed the first time. And I held this baby and I thought about all the years of cheese strings and yellow walls and wine glasses washed before bed and mortgage payments and grocery lists and choosing not to stop. I thought about that Thursday morning in October when I became, without choosing it, a woman who did everything alone. I thought about how that woman would not recognize the person standing in this room right now, holding her granddaughter, surrounded by people who know exactly who she is. His face went pale at the wedding. He sat down. And I sat down too, because I had said what needed saying to the people who needed to hear it in front of everyone he had spent 30 years trying to impress. That was enough. That has always been enough. My granddaughter's name is June. She was born on a Tuesday, just before the light changed, and when they put her in my arms, she looked at me with that ancient, slightly suspicious expression that newborns have, as if they're still deciding whether this world is worth the trouble. I told her it was. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the wedding, not Gerald's face, not even the first time I held June. It's a Tuesday morning sometime in the mid-90s, standing at a kitchen counter in a rented house on the east side of Hamilton, packing a school lunch with whatever was in the fridge, and thinking, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way exhaustion talks to you when no one else is around. I kept doing it. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is detail. But I've been thinking lately about why it turned out the way it did. Not in a self-congratulatory way, more the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. Because it didn't have to go this way. Gerald had more resources than I did. He had lawyers and NDAs and 30 years of practice making things disappear. The injured workers who came before me had tried to speak and been silenced. I had a folder, a contact at an old firm, and a stubborn, quiet conviction that some things shouldn't be allowed to stay buried. What I've come to understand is that it was never really about courage. Courage sounds dramatic. What I had was something slower and less glamorous. It was just the refusal to pretend. I spent 4 months gathering those documents, not because I was brave, but because I couldn't unknow what I knew. That's a kind of integrity, I suppose, the unglamorous kind that doesn't announce itself, that just sits there in your chest and makes certain choices impossible to avoid. And the intelligence it required, I don't mean cleverness. I mean the willingness to think carefully when feeling carefully would have been so much easier. To ask, what do I actually know and what am I assuming? To talk to the right person, read the right records, wait until the information was solid before acting on it. Emotion without that kind of thinking would have had me blowing up the engagement on a hallway conversation and losing my daughter's trust permanently. The two things had to work together, what I felt and what I could actually prove. The part I got wrong was the waiting. I told myself I was protecting her. I was. But I was also protecting myself from a conversation I didn't know how to start. She lost 6 weeks with me because of that silence, and I lost 6 weeks with her, and those weeks cost both of us something we didn't get back. The lesson in that isn't about being fearless. It's about trusting the people you love with hard things, even when the timing feels impossible. My daughter was stronger than I gave her credit for. She always had been. I taught her that, and then forgot to apply it. What Gerald built over 30 years came apart because the people he had silenced eventually found each other. One folder, one journalist, one advocacy organization, and suddenly the silence had a shape that could be named and challenged. That's how these things work. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small honest acts by people who decided that looking away wasn't something they could live with. June doesn't know any of this yet. She's too young, but I'll tell her someday. Not as a story about her grandmother, but as a story about what kind of person is worth becoming. Someone who does the work, Someone who thinks before they act and acts before it's too late. Someone who, when they're put in a room full of people and told to stay quiet, decides that sitting down is not the only option. I sat down eventually. I always do. But first I stood up.